Thank you so much, Deborah. I appreciate being invited to York College of CUNY. And I hope this presentation, and this is a workshop, and you will actively become involved very shortly. So I hope that you gain something from this that you can use in your classroom. You received 4 handouts, and one of them is actually a formative assessment for me. And you will provide this to me at the end of the day. And this allows you to list things, and please fill this out as you proceed. So that's one. Another one is an abridged version of this presentation. So not every slide is given to you, but most of the slides are provided because there is some redundancy in the presentation. So I've made this sort of eco-friendly with the important slides. The third is a reading for which I have received copyright permission, Tales of Wonder, Adventures of Chasing the Divine by Houston Smith and Jeffrey Payne. It will be a wonderful, inspirational reading, I promise, and you will actually concept map what's in these pages. And it will be a little bit tricky to concept map it because there's many different things you could concept map, many different places you could start. But we'll do that in a few moments. And then finally, if someone is interested in further knowledge about concept mapping, I have provided the paper that I presented at the International Conference on Concept Mapping in Tallinn, Estonia, and Helsinki, Finland. So today the title of our presentation is Construction of Concept Maps by Students Provides a Learning-Centered Environment in the Classroom. So in previous presentations of this, somebody in the audience said, I would really like to know a little bit about what is a concept map, because I've come to the presentation, I've heard about concept maps, but I haven't necessarily constructed a concept map prior to coming to this. So I thought I'd just mention a little bit about what concept maps are. Now you have to excuse the size of this. I will work through this back from the back of the room. You're not going to necessarily be able to read this, but I will sort of show you what we're going through. The idea of a concept map is that it is a knowledge organizer. And so it can be used in teaching, it can be used in our own thinking about anything we have to think about. Joseph Novak is hoping that corporations will actually start using this. Think about the political sort of structure of your university, how nice it would be when you first came to this university if somebody provided you with a concept map of here's our organizational scheme, instead of sub-council of faculty, faculty, whatever else, which we just have a hard time keeping in mind what fits where. So concept mapping certainly can be used by students, it can be used by ourselves, it can be used when we are, in fact, writing our own publications in any field. The concept maps, as they're known right now, were developed by Joseph Novak. He was interested in longitudinally studying the development of ideas in young people. And so he had children in elementary school, and he would track them, their learning of a certain topic, not only through elementary school, but then he would also track them further beyond their elementary school experience into their junior high, high school sorts of experiences. And he would start them with a concept, and then he would want to understand how did they develop their knowledge about that concept. And so as he and his collaborators were working through all of the data, they said, how do we organize these data? We have so much here. How do we get this to a point where we can start talking about, data, and get this to a point where we're actually able to analyze some of this knowledge progression? And so they came up with the idea of concept mapping the development of thinking in these students on that particular topic they were doing. So the students not only concept mapped, but the observers concept mapped what the student development what was occurring with student development. So a concept map is a knowledge organizer, and it is organized in a hierarchical manner. So concept maps developed by Joseph Novak help to answer some focus question. So when you concept map your reading today, your team will decide what is a focus, either question, issue, topic. It doesn't have to be a question. And you will work on this map, and you will start with that idea. That's at the top. So these are hierarchically organized structures. So you organize your knowledge. The organized knowledge is comprised of concepts. Now the concepts are these blocked phrases. So when you develop a concept map, you are going to put the concept in your Post-it note, all right? Now the idea of concept maps is that you don't see all full long sentences in any one of these blocks. So the concepts are labeled with symbols or words. They are connected by linking words. And when you connect them with a linking verb, you form a proposition. And so it's kind of a noun, verb, noun structure, but it's a visual of this, all right? So it is the linkages that end up forming the units of meaning. So that becomes very important. So when you concept map this reading, you will start and you will say, what are the main concepts that were addressed in this reading? And you will simply put those on a Post-it note, and you will cluster them according to pieces that fit together. And then at some point, you will want to say, how are these pieces connected? Or how are these defined in relation to each other? And then you will provide arrows with connecting words. And so it's these connecting words that provide us with the meaning of what between the concepts. One thing that's really important to realize is that concept maps allow for an immense amount of creativity. And so this is a beautiful thing, and you need, if you're going to use these in the classroom, you want to be very open to the varied creativity that will arise from your concept maps. One of the beautiful things is that Novak states is there is no one correct concept map for any particular concept. There are many. So what are our learning objectives and activities for today? They're fourfold. I would like to take just a few minutes to review critical thinking, why it is that we are, what it is that we're trying to get our students to progress to, and I will present that according to Anderson et al. Anderson et al. 2001 is a revision of Bloom's taxonomy from 1956. Thank you very much. That's lovely. It's been updated. Let's use Anderson et al. And some of the original authors from Bloom's 1956 paper are also on the 2001 paper. We will take just a few minutes to do that. Then we will actually construct a Novakian concept map. And you will use about 20 minutes of this time that we have today in your groups to get as far as you can in 20 minutes. And I will warn you now, it will be very frustrating at the 20-minute mark because you'll be right in the middle of it. You'll want to finish because we are people who are used to finishing projects. But I will say, okay, let's wrap this up because now we want to discuss. So after that, we will discuss what are some of the uses of concept maps in your classrooms. Then we will review some assessment techniques. These have been around for a while. There are some very simple assessment techniques. And more recently, since they've had these international conferences, they bring together people from all over the world who are using concept maps. And one group of people are very keen on assessing the maps in terms of being able to give numbers to the maps. And so that you can actually decide whether a map is a well-constructed map and basically grade it, or whether it's a map that's quite lacking, all right? So there are assessments, and I will provide you with some of those. We won't have time to do any assessing because of, this is an hour-and-a-half workshop. But you will be provided with those, and those are also provided on your handout. And then finally, of course, we want to end with reviewing some advantages and disadvantages of using this learning tool, all right? So are there any questions where we're going? This is where we're heading. So critical thinking, this is Anderson et al., the revision of Bloom's taxonomy. And this is one of the slides that you do have. And I don't want to spend a lot of time hashing out, are we talking knowledge dimension or factual dimension? Are we talking the factual, conceptual, or procedurals? Or are we discussing metacognition? But I want to ask the question, why is it that we're here? What is it in terms of cognitive processes that we want our students to be able to do? You all are dedicated faculty. You're here because you want your students to gain certain things or to progress to certain knowledge dimensions or progress through certain cognitive processes. And what are some of these? So this is the interactive part already. And what I ask is that when we go to the tables, I'm going to ask one person from the table to participate. And then once you've participated, when we have another one, please let someone else in the group participate. So from this table, what would you say that you're wanting your students to gain from one of your courses? And speak up in lecture mode, teaching mode. That strong affirmative voice. So someone from this group, share with me in terms of, are you asking students to be at a remember level? Are you asking students to create? What are you doing in your classes?
I think for nursing it's more maybe synthesize, analyze, be able to apply then to your particular situation those areas that we're stressing with them, socialization, politics, whatever it might be.
Good. And I will argue that concept mapping is going to be able to allow students to look at a case study and say, oh, from what I learned, this applies to it, and therefore I might be using, this protocol. All right, so from this table here.
Well, I'm in finance. I'd say very similar to what you have in nursing, that students are expected to analyze a scenario.
Good.
We have case studies, we do have scenario analysis.
Good.
Yes, they have to analyze, understand the concept and analyze.
Good. So we're talking about moving students beyond just the basic facts that they learned in the earlier courses to understanding those and then moving to apply and analyze those. And so these are building skills from this table. Yes.
Hi, I teach history. I like my students to be able to compare and contrast.
Great. And so if they're going to compare and contrast, sometimes all they want to do is compare and they forget about the contrasting side of things, or they just contrast and they forget about the comparing side. So concept maps, you could even construct concept maps where they're coming together is where they're similar, and where they're diverging is where they're different. And you can start saying to students, oh, okay, compare and contrast. Where do you see this on your map? From this table. Yes.
Nursing, I would want them to be able to say, for example, develop a care plan based on, what they have.
You're wanting your students to evaluate. Here they're given some portfolio of a patient. They need to evaluate that portfolio. They need to create something. And so now we're working on moving up these higher level cognitive processes. And I would argue that concept maps is a tool that's going to allow people to do that. All right? Good. So what's exciting is that we're wanting our students to work at these higher cognitive thinking skills. So now we move into the point where you get to work in teams. Actually, you can decide if you want to work in subgroups in your table or whether you want the whole group to work together. This large table, I would say, divide into two groups. Smaller tables, I would say, work in one group. But let me explain for a moment how you do this. You say, wait a minute, I don't know how I'm going to do this. You've put a piece of paper in front of me. You put a bunch of Post-it notes. What am I to do? So let me just explain a little bit about what you're to do. And this is from Novak's 1998 book, his Appendix 1. And this actually tells you exactly what you're going to do. You do have this as one of your slides. And so this is on page 3, the top slide. But let me just go through it so you have a sense of what you're doing. You will be reading, you will be taking this from this inspirational reading. I just got copyright permission yesterday, so it made me very happy to be able to provide this to you, because if it came in tomorrow, then I wasn't going to be able to use it. So this is a really inspiring reading about a person who is so positively affected by a teacher. So you will identify, I'm not sure there's really a question in there, but there's certainly a major point that Houston Smith wants to say in this. So you will identify some major point that you want as your topic at the top of this map, and that really becomes the title of the map. And then what you'll do is you'll identify major concepts that are pertinent to this, and that's what's going to go onto your Post-it notes. And those should be 1 to 3 words. Don't make these entire sentences, all right? Just 1 to 3 words. So that's a concept. Then you're going to place those, you're going to write those out first of all, and obviously first you need to read it, and we'll give you a break to read that in a moment. But once you've had enough time to read it, and your group says, oh, what do we want to, what is a take-home message here? And there should be some discussion on this. It won't be easy, because this is not a reading that is easily hierarchically arranged. Then you'll have your topic. Then you'll say, oh, what are some of the other things that Houston Smith and Jeffrey Payne brought up that support this main topic. And then you start branching these off and you find clusters. So you'll place these major concepts at the top, then you identify sub-concepts and components. And you place those in the appropriate place. This is organized, the traditional Novakian concept maps are organized in a hierarchical manner, pyramidical almost. So you're going to rank these from the broadest, most general, so the inclusive ones are at the top, and the more specifics are branching down below. This will take you most of, I would say, probably 15 of the 20 minutes that we're going to devote to this exercise. For the last 5 minutes, and I think we'll try to time this because I have 12:30 now, and so we'll let you do the posting. By 1:45, you want to be adding some lines because it's the linking phrases that connect the two concepts that derive the meaning of that relationship. And that's what Novak thinks is so important. So the connection creates the meaning. Now, if you had more time and if you were some of my students, you would be revising your idea when we next met in class. But we'll take you up to this point where you have some linkages. So let's see what... So when I run my upper level courses, I do not lecture. I currently do not give an exam, and students construct concept maps each and every class period. We're in an electronic room. We use CMAP tools, and for every topic that I would have lectured on, the students have readings, primary literature, secondary literature, textbooks, and they in fact construct concept maps on those topics. And then their portfolio is handed to me, graded, along with some writing that associates. So because this is what we do for 14 weeks in the semester, I actually spend the better part of the first week introducing students to concept maps, getting them used to the software package that we use, the software tool that we use. And I actually ask them to concept map Appendix 1, which is what I just gave you. And so this is a concept map from 2 of my students. And they say, how do you build a concept map? You identify a focus question. It addresses problems, issues, or knowledge. You determine a certain number of concepts, broadest at the top. You build the concept map by selecting subcomponents. You create hierarchies. You have some structure to the map. Oh, you might have to add, subtract, and change. We have to be working with each other and decide, oh, okay, I want to add this. Okay, let's add it. I think this one doesn't belong. It maybe belongs over there. Okay, let's discuss why it belongs over there and not here. May need to rework. This especially occurs when they meet the next time. They'll typically work on a topic for a week. But what I really like is then you gain new knowledge, you gain new insights. This new knowledge alters the knowledge you had before. This should sound familiar. This is what teaching is about, right? This is called constructivist theory, that we are, in fact, building upon a scaffold that does already exist. Sometimes we need to tear that scaffolding a little bit apart because there are misconceptions. But this is constructivist theory, and it is similar, and it is the base of problem-based learning also. And you all had a presentation, a workshop by Mark Serva from University of Delaware on problem-based learning. So both of us are working in the same sort of pedagogical theory. The connecting lines are labeled with linking words, and these define the relationships between concepts. When I have my students construct maps, I want them to tell me what are the important parts of this map, not just at the top, but somewhere embedded in the map. And these students chose new knowledge and relationships between concepts as being important in this particular Appendix 1 that they had to concept map. That was their first exercise to get them comfortable with concept mapping. And again, that's Joseph Novak's concept map about concept mapping. So now what we want to do is you want to be constructing this concept map. As you're constructing this concept map, you're probably going to be thinking, for what purposes in my classroom can I use this? When should I use it? What kind of tools does she talk about that are out there? So when we finish this 20 minutes, and now we're at 12:35, so we'll go till 10 of 1. When we finish this, then we're going to have a discussion back and forth based on some of these, all right? So now we break into our groups, and you get to read Houston Smith's few pages from Tales of Wonder, and you get to start working with your groups. So you need some time to read first, and then you decide. And I would say, decide amongst yourself. I think this group probably would work well as a single group, probably. But if you want to work in really small groups, you can. This table, I would suggest splitting into 2 groups because it starts getting a little cumbersome unless you want to work all as a group, whatever works best. Okay, wherever you are, we're going to have to stop this process at this point. The idea was that I've introduced you to concept mapping, and you have been provided an experience that is like what the students will experience. And I think that's important for us when we teach. Sometimes we've been doing something so frequently that it's second nature to us, and when we provide a new innovation, we need to practice it ourselves as if we are a student. So you see that you get to a certain point, or maybe you're discussing some things and you're having this great discussion, but you didn't necessarily have lines drawn anywhere. It doesn't matter. The idea is that you've been a student for a while. You've got the sense that you are provided with some reading in this case, and you don't always have to be provided a reading. You can ask students to concept map something that they've learned from previous courses and that they should know, and you can then help them identify what they've forgotten or praise them for what they do know. But I often use concept mapping for students with some readings, textbook, primary, secondary literature, sometimes integrating all of those. But you've gotten a sense of kind of what you struggle with. And I like my concept maps in my classes to be collaborative, even if it's for a recitation when we're talking about biology and major macromolecules. I'll have some students stand at the board and other students will talk to that person and they'll concept map as collaboratively. So you've gotten the sense of how people have to work together, and that's something, of course, we're always wanting to do. So for what purposes, and this is where I stand at a computer and type, so what purposes in your classroom do you imagine that you might be able to use something like this? And let's go in the reverse direction we went before, and somebody speak who didn't speak before. So somebody from this table. For what purpose in the classroom? Or when in the classroom? Either one.
Providing an introduction to a new chapter. Providing an introduction to a new chapter.
Good. And we have a gentleman, Mike, who would you like to say when you use concept maps in your classroom?
Well, I do not use them collaboratively. I use them on the board to communicate ideas from myself to the students. But I'm here to learn how to do them more collaboratively.
And you said your concepts, you concept map things that are very complex in order to allow students to understand them graphically.
Yes.
So what you're seeing is that you now have, or when you've seen some of the concept maps I provided, and I'll show you some others, this is a graphical representation of a lot of knowledge. And so we're graphical, many of us are visual kinds of learners, and so it takes a lot of information and distills it in a manner that lets our brains work with it a little more easily sometimes than just reading text. Yes?
It strikes me that this would be extremely effective for some students, but that other students might have brains that don't work that way, and I wonder if that's how you run your whole class, how that works out.
So we can say, here's a question. So the question is, what about non-visual learners? And we want to talk about that when we get to the advantages or disadvantages. How I run my upper level classes are classes that are limited to 10 people. I take students on field trips, and so we can fit in a van. So I make sure that those students who are signing up for the class, I have a 30-minute discussion with them prior, to registration, and they know what they're getting into. So if a student is uncomfortable, and many students are uncomfortable with a course that has no exams. They want an exam because that's what they're used to. And so I let them know that this is a class where you will be producing a portfolio, and there will be no exams. And so I need to let them know that. But that's a good point. If you run an entire class of 150, might you lose people?
I'm just wondering what kind of software you use. You say use software because like the one I use for my AC230 course is called Inspiration.
Yes.
You can draw the concept map, and then you can also translate, the software will translate into the verbal, I mean the
Yes.
word, like the outline.
Yes, and
So
so you
both-
can use inspiration. What did I want to do here? Where did my page go? So we'll add that to this part here. So I'm not wanting to print. I can do this. Inspiration is another software tool. CMAP Tools allows you to do the same thing.
I use Atlas TI and it has a network view that does this. Is this CMAP, is that open source?
Yes. You can download it on any computers. It's all maintained on the web. It's free. All right, so some other ideas.
For students to share clinical situations with other students, because I frequently ask them to, prompt them to do that, but if they know they have to do that in advance, this gives them a method to do that.
Sometimes it helps to tell students, this is your homework. You're going to do this at home. You're going to come to class, and then we're going to discuss things. That could be useful. Yes?
For establishing cause and effect relationships in scientific courses.
Very good. Because that's what we're talking about here. You can do some nice feedback loops. You can have arrows going in both directions. Good. So when in a course might this be useful? When might you introduce concept maps, or when in your course might you have students using concept maps?
After I've spoken about a new idea, I would ask them to map it to help them consolidate the information.
So after you've introduced it, then students construct their own knowledge. All right. Yes?
There's also like a way you might get them to kind of haul up what they already know about this before you start talking about something new.
Right. We don't just have to use turning point, right? This is to assess previous knowledge retained. All right. Yes.
I think I would like to see it used both at the beginning of the section and then again either into the section or at the end of it and see how it changes.
That's great. To assess knowledge acquisition.
Or change in knowledge.
I have students, CMAP Tools allows you to do a compare first and final. I use that. Yes?
Maybe to categorize things, to group details in broad categories, which I find students have a lot of difficulty.
So cluster analysis of some sort. Okay? Great.
How about a new reading?
Good. Just like what you did.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So lots and lots of uses, hopefully some that you can see right, in your classes that you might be interested in allowing your students to do. You don't need to use CMAP tools. You don't have to have a computer facility. If I'm running my entire class this way, I want a computer facility. But you can use all sorts of, draw it on a piece of paper, do these post-it note sorts of things. So I have my students, this is not a traditional Novakian concept map. This is not using CMAP tools, it's just using a PowerPoint. These students loved color, they loved clusters of things. And so what is ecology? They talked about an article we discussed, another chapter set, populations and lots of things to do with populations, and the basic idea that ecology involves interactions between organisms and environment. Other students, this is how complex things can get. Don't worry about reading these, but the idea is that if you have students working on maps, do not underestimate how complex those maps can be. I had my students at the beginning of the semester say off the top of your head, and you can use chapter 1 in the book, tell me what you think ecology is. At the end of the semester, because people are saying, you know, you're not giving exams, are your students learning? I decided, well, I can do compare CMAPs, and I can say, you know, I can give an actual value as to how their knowledge increased, and this group's knowledge clearly increased. This is not their first map, that's their final map. And this is using CMAP tools. CMAP tools is hard to show visually. I don't use them in presentations because the font, things get too small to actually read. The idea is you can see complexity. So students can come up with incredibly complex maps that show very, very detailed understanding of things. And if you have assessors who say, oh, you know, how do you know they're learning? You can show them some of these maps. You can score them. Okay? So now what we want to do is to talk about assessment. So let's say that you want to provide an opportunity for students to concept map. Maybe you don't want to assess those maps. Maybe you want to say, you know what, I just want to use it in my recitation. My students are struggling with a certain concept, and I want them to come to the board and concept map this. I'll be right there. I'll be able to catch if they're concept mapping something erroneously, and then we're going to erase that when I leave. That's what I use in my recitation in my introductory classes. But if I'm going to run a course that has no lectures, has no exams, then I'd better be able to assess the portfolio that the students provide to me. And I assess each concept map, and I use it in multiple ways, and I never just talk about scores. I also have, in the rubric, I also have participation score. I also have various other elements. But how is it that you can assess a map in and of itself? One way that Novak and Gowan in their 1984 book talked about is simply an additive kind of thing, where they suggest that the linking phrases are worth 1 point, and they just chose some points. You could change this. You don't have to use these points, and this again is provided you in your handout. Hierarchy levels, that would mean each of those levels. So you started with your 1, and then it branches, and you sort of have a second or a third, a fourth. These maps that I showed you are so complex, it takes a good amount of time to count and find out how many levels there are. I have students self-assess. I don't have my students lying to me. As they're doing it, they come up, I provide them, all right, you need to assess yourself using these scoring schemes, and part of your rubric is you have to tell me what your score was using those. I don't have students lying. They're not telling me they did something they didn't do. I can check them quickly, but why should I be spending my time counting their hierarchy structures when they could be counting? When I have them do it, I always have them stop at their first one after a certain period of time, like their first class period, and I say, now you've got to do all the rubrics and scoring schemes here. Do the same thing when you finish. Now you see your development. That's metacognition. That's thinking about thinking. They see their first, what is ecology? They see their final. Folks, that's what you learned in this class. There's some beauty to that, and I think sometimes those can be lost on students. So you can have a simple additive kind of thing. Cross-linkages are things where an element goes to another part of the map. This is a cross-link. You have a cluster here, you have a branching pattern here, and now it clusters and goes quite far down. Their new knowledge alters their previous knowledge, and I don't know what I did there, but whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Let's edit undo that one. Okay.
On one of, excuse me, on
Yes.
one of those maps, could you show us an example of hierarchies?
Of hierarchy, yes. Well, in fact, I think that one's too complex. These are very, very complex. So you start here, and this is what is ecology is the question. Then your first hierarchy is this branch here. Now this is starting to branch, and you start working down. This gets a little complex to read. Let me go to another one. It works both ways. They're deconstructing and then they're reconstructing. So in fact, they're doing both, and they're doing them quite often flip-flopping back and forth. And so that's part of the beauty of it. So I often use the terms deconstructing and reconstructing, but you can use inductive, deductive.
Can you go back to the slide, like with the scoring mechanism?
Yes. So yes.
My question is, if you let an expert to draw a concept map, and then as a novice, a student to draw another one, maybe the student may have more linkages, may have more complex hierarchies, maybe they have misconceptions. I mean,
yes.
If you give a score, maybe the expert may have a lower score than the student. So how do you deal with that?
So there's a problem. Sometimes you can have, if you just have them adding things up, what about the things that are wrong? So now they've come, and the idea is that if you are scoring the maps or they're scoring the maps, you want to make sure that as they're going through that they're really not making the mistakes, right? Because any learning of misinformation, and here now they're embedding that misinformation in their head, that's a problem. It does happen. So you want to, when I have my class, I'm walking around the classroom, and if I find something, I say, oop, let's rethink that, okay? I don't give them the answer, but I say, let's rethink that because I'm having some problems with this. So you try to get them to rework it. Then you say, oh, well, if they just do the map and they score it themselves, maybe they scored erroneous pieces of it. I do make checks of that, and to make sure there aren't erroneous pieces, and the erroneous pieces, you could you could have a subtracting value here. You don't have to use these exact things. There are some additional scales in which they have taken that, more recent scales that they have taken that into account. So the CMAP tools is one I've told you about, and then the more recent maps, the more recent scoring techniques. So there's a 3 easy, 1, 2, 3 easy sorts of levels. You could score that easily. It's a simplistic map. I concept map my own philosophies on things. But the more advanced, here's some additional scoring rubrics, and these are ones that came to light through my literature research on concept mapping. And these are ones that are presented at international conferences. And so this one is one in which there's a grading scale. They call it a topological scale because it's really kind of getting at, what does that map look like? And so you start at a very basic level where the concepts are lengthy, the linkages are lacking, and the complexity is linear, where you don't really have bifurcations. You just have hierarchy of organization, and it's a single link to a link to a link to a link. That's not telling you a whole lot. And then you work your way up to the higher levels where there's at least 3 hierarchy levels. There's numerous branching patterns, 5 to 6. This is a scoring rubric that was used for middle schools. So, elementary school, middle school. So our college students very quickly get up to the higher levels. But now you start having these cross-linkages. And cross-linkages are really important in that they show higher level thinking, but that's where you want to tell students, you don't put in a cross-link when it doesn't make sense. It has to make sense. You don't just add one in that doesn't mean something. And so people have to really think about these cross-linkages. So they can get to the level 5 if there is some component that's related to something distant. But it's actually pretty hard to get to level 6 unless they're reading something that's quite complex, or unless they're doing some sorts of comparison contrasts kind of things. And then the most recent from the 2008 International Conference is one that has recognized that they can have erroneous pieces, and we need to deduct points for those. So this one's very complex, and again, I ask my students to do this for themselves. They get faster at scoring themselves than I would. Where there's 6 different criteria, and one relates to concepts, one relates to that semantic unit, the concept, linking words, concept. One relates to, if you have erroneous propositions, if you have erroneous propositions, we are going to deduct points now. And then we get to, wow, let's take those propositions, and if there's some movement to them, if there is some directionality to them, that gets very complex. Not all propositions are going to have a direction. This inhibits the production of that molecule, or this, allows for the synthesis of something. Then you get to these cross-linkages, and now they talk about the quality and the quantity. So they're getting very, very detailed. And then they got to this highest criteria, most difficult, are their cycles. And I tell my students, you can't make up a cycle that doesn't mean anything just to get those higher points. So when this becomes part of my rubric, I'm not going to expect that every map is at a very high level. I'm going to say that those students, as long as they reach the high level, then they were all right with that map. If I was expecting cycles on that topic, then maybe they needed to get up to the higher values.
Is this grading scale a domain generic one, or just it has to consider is the physics or is
It's generic. You can go to the citation, read it, and it could be used for anything. You can get the details about what these different points are, values are, and you don't have to use this. This may be a model that you use and you make up your own. But the idea is they were recognizing that things needed to get a little bit more complex as students in higher levels were starting to use these. So those are some assessments. There's a lot of information packed in that, but I have provided the references for those.
I was going to ask, in your practice, in your daily classroom practice, how closely, I mean, do you sort of each week and each day sort of stay with the sort of concept map as your main pedagogy? Or do you mix it up?
In my classrooms, it depends on which level you're talking about. When I work with my freshman, my biology student, that is, we are working at the remember and understand levels. Mm-hmm. And so that is your freshman biology course, and I need to do things, get across those foundational knowledge skills so that courses can build on those. Mm-hmm. So in those courses, I use concept mapping as a tool to help students in the recitation period. I don't like to construct concept maps for students in those learning environments because they could make them themselves and that's how they're going to learn. I think it's very good to use a concept map if something's very complex and you want the students then to see the complexity and you help them with that complexity. But in my situations, I try to keep, I want my students at that level to make their own maps. Now when I do my junior and senior level courses, then those courses are in fact concept mapping courses, and they are every day working on concept maps.
So the key really is that they must be involved in making the map.
Absolutely, I mean, that's part of the whole rubric. I mean, it's a rubric that's based on many things, and one of the things is that if a topic takes a week to complete or four class periods to complete, each member has to have been at that meeting. Every member has to have participated on that in that setting. And so I have had students going for medical school interviews, and they have emailed their friends what they were going to do. With this Collaborate, they could have been on the train and said, oh, we have a class meeting at 10, I'll log on at 10 and I'll collaborate with you. Because electronically, they could be altering the map as they're on their train up to their seminar here, and their friends are in their classroom. Our students are very, very responsible. They know that they're going to get a point taken off for that 12-point block if they miss a class period. If they don't then make it up and provide their teammates with their work, they make it up.
Could you see the concept map not just, let's say, as an end goal, but as a step towards creating a narrative? Because on campus we're very much concerned with the writing process, and because I teach history, which is a discipline very much geared towards reading and writing, I could see doing this as a step in helping students to create their own narrative. The thing is, when you said they deconstruct and then they reconstruct, and it's a way for them to understand how to paraphrase or summarize something rather than just...
I almost planted you. Part of my rubric, when my students work on these maps, for every map they construct in these upper level classes, they must have a written single PowerPoint slide. And it's going to be bulleted, but those bullets better be well written, they better convey the idea, and their last bullet better be the take-home kicker point. So I haven't shown those because then the slide presentation starts getting long. But my students, because we all want our students to write well, and the idea is that what we've all come to realize is that a person who can write well is thinking clearly. You don't write well if your thinking is muddled. And so it's all part of this, that yes, now they've somehow hopefully this process has clarified their thinking, and now, quick, write. And if they've done a good map, it's very easy to write. And then the other side of things is that I like the collaborative side, because then students have to kind of, they'll be, oh, you know, I think this is what that map says. And somebody will say, no, you know what, I really think this. And so you'll see them in the writing phase struggling with each other and struggling to get that proper phrasing of what it was that they meant to say from the map. So I like to see people struggle in writing, not in that, oh, I don't know how to form a sentence, but what is it I really meant to say? And
yeah, because for some of these students, the writing, it's like painful. You know, they just don't know where to start or how to organize. And this, I think, is a wonderful preliminary step.
And we like to write too. And so I actually concept map every research project I do now, every paper I write, because if you want to write a paper efficiently and well and clearly, you could concept map it. And it's going to change.
Is concept mapping the best tool for declarative knowledge? Do you have a good example, like showing how to use concept map for procedural knowledge?
Sure. I mean, we could, in some classes, one of the amazing things about going to the International Concept Map Conference was seeing how concept maps are being used. In Panama, all school children somewhere in the age of 4th grade to 7th grade learn how to concept map, and then they keep concept mapping for years after that, and the government supports this. So this is a national trend and a national initiative. In Costa Rica, one of the most inspiring stories I heard was in Costa Rica, there was a person who decided to open a school for troubled youths, and he's deeply embedded in C-mapping. Everything that those students do, they concept map. So these are students who were told, apparently, you know, you're not going to succeed, you're too much trouble, and they get sent to the school, and he has them concept map. What is it that made it so that now you are here? What is it why are you here? And what is it that has brought you here? And who do you want to be? And how are you going to get there? So then they have these therapy sessions, they all concept map. He says they concept map how they're training to be chefs and things. They concept map recipes. If you can concept map a recipe, you can do concept map what's going on in the lab. Now, sometimes it's just a flow chart. And if it's just a flow chart, you don't concept map because you're not having that complexity. But there's lots of different uses. So let's review some advantages, disadvantages of concept mapping. And we want to think not only of the value to the students, but we also want to think of value to teachers. Because obviously we're in these interactions. And disadvantages, let's add to the disadvantages the question that concept mapping really focuses on visual learning. And these are important to keep in mind. I don't want to come across and say, oh, you know, concept maps, it's the answer for everything. We want to make sure that when you're thinking about, you know, what it is you want to do in your classroom, whatever innovative techniques, you want to think, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages, what am I comfortable with, how are my students going to be using this? So what are some of the advantages in terms of value to students or value to us as teachers? Yes?
You'll find a way to express this pithily. The students that I teach often have a lot of difficulty writing, expressing themselves in writing. So if I can get them to link a few basic concepts, I think that's a stepping stone. You know, they can accomplish that rather easily, and then they can go on to try to put that more basic construction into a grammatical, to understand sentence.
Yeah, I really think that concept mapping by itself has one value, but I really think that next step is having them write. Other ideas?
Gives them another tool when they're stuck, which certainly gives us another tool when we're stuck also.
Normally my Thursdays start at 7 in the morning and they end at 9 at night. By 8 o'clock I'm hitting the wall mentally. And my students can see it, and some things I'm thinking in my brain and something else comes out of my mouth, and we call it hitting the wall. So sometimes our students do hit the wall. They're finding that block, and somehow the tools that they've been provided, they've tried, and they say, but I did that and it didn't work. And then you can say, okay, here's another idea. And maybe concept mapping works and maybe it doesn't work for them. Yes?
I could see it as a way where collaboration is pretty easy. People to engage in collaboration very quickly. There's not a lot of barriers, that is.
This can also be true for faculty. I'm collaboratively working on a paper, and it's a 6-author paper. Most of the work is being done by 2 of us, but the 2 of us, we concept mapped this paper before we started. And again, the paper is not what we started concept mapping due to the results. It's been modified, but we can concept map and we can say, oh, okay, was that the understanding of where our paper was meant to go? And then we can kind of look at it and look at each other later and say, interesting, paper didn't go in the direction we thought it would, but that's because the results, showed us something different. So yes, some other ideas?
Yes. One of the things that I find maddening sometimes with students is that when they tell me they're studying, what they're really doing is rereading the same thing over and over again. And they're not getting anything beyond the first, or maybe the first and a half reading, they're just reading. So concept maps is one of the things I have suggested to some of them, just to make them engage with it a little bit, so that at least they're doing something with the information instead of just reciting it endlessly.
Yeah, rereading and reading and rereading your lecture notes. What good is that? My students will come in, they'll say, but I read and I reread and I reread my lecture notes, but I didn't do well in the exam. And I'll say, well, you know what? Maybe your brain was, oh, I knew what this was. And I remind them that maybe their brain is actually reading to the answer that's listed just below, and they think they know it, but when they put that notebook away and now they have to somehow explain it, maybe they haven't quite got it. And so this is putting those notes away and saying, okay, now I need to try to make this map. So it could be a good study tool prior to an exam. Put your notes away. Now tell me what the major macromolecules are that are important in biology.
I think it will allow students to think.
Isn't that what we all want?
Just to add to that, I think it encourages kinesthetic learning.
Mm-hmm. Good.
It's sort of a follow-up to the 4th point where it says provide something when they hit the wall. It also gives them somewhere to start that is not nothing.
Okay.
I've had no experience with this, but for others who have, do students like it? Do they find that it's fun? Or are they, what's their reaction to this?
Anybody?
I think the latest literature shows there are 2 versions. Like you got comparing 2 groups. One group is you have a student to construct a concept map, and then you have the online agent, computer-based agent, to use that concept map to carry out certain behaviors. And then the other group is you control the avatar in the game without creating that concept map, and you're comparing the learning result of it to the groups. So those who are making concept maps and control the avatar are more engaged based upon the study, and they have a better learning result. So I think it's both engaging and effective based upon that literature that I found.
I think too that in some parts of the country, I know that in nursing they're using concept maps a lot instead of doing care plans as we used to. And they find that the students become much more engaged, and they think at a higher level, and they have to see how to care for their patients.
Well, I think it allows them to see the connections, their relationship, almost like the systems theory, and how one will impact on the other to ultimately create a bigger holistic picture. So I think that's where nursing, I think, benefits from it.
Nursing has picked up on it big time. All right, how about value to us as teachers? Mike? Because you're using it.
It definitely helps me clarify my own thoughts.
Okay. Yes.
It's something else, something different for the students to do.
I do think the novelty part is important. They get to try something different.
I mean, I've done it to present. I teach documented production, and I've used it to present how I generated an idea and show all the interactions. So I think it can show how it's like an idea generation, and all the interactions of potentially characters and themes can come out of it, and just show that, give them an example of how you can take a concept and say, well, what are all the things that may relate to that, and then hopefully come around to some sort of, treatment of it, like how you're going to tell the story.
And you're getting at a really interesting part where you're saying, I'm showing them how I think. And I love the fact that in education now, metacognition is coming to the forefront, where we want our students, as you're mapping this, think about how you're thinking, or take that first and final map. Look at it. You should delight in the change. One hopes it's changed. Or, be happy that you had 3 ideas and you had 3 questions, and you spent your whole time discussing with each other, what is the more important question here? Because that's a great thing.
I imagine maybe we can know students' difficulties in understanding better. Meaning, like, what is the real obstacles in understanding of the materials?
So kind of like,
I imagine I never tried.
so sort of in a manner that the turning point allows us to identify areas where students are struggling. All right. I think yes.
Well, I mean, the related idea too, I think, is that we're modeling for students how we're thinking through it, and which is also something we're being asked to do more of. Show them how I got from A to D instead of just saying I did.
Oh, those bothersome double L's. All right. So that's another metacognition. And I think it's good for us to talk to our students. This is metacognition. This is what we talk about when we think about thinking. So misunderstandings, some disadvantages. Can they promote misunderstandings? You mentioned that concept maps can have erroneous errors. They can have erroneous elements. You bet they do. There's published papers on that say, you betcha. So it's not just concepts, but it's relationships. We need to work with our students to help them identify that. Or I was walking around and students were talking about evolution, natural selection, and they kind of they had things backwards. And I said to them, oh, you all are 4th-year biology students. Let's think this one through. Are you sure that's what you want to say? Is that the direction of the arrows that you want it going? And I could work with them, and then I could step back and say, now you all figure it out. It's up to you to figure out. But I'm alerting you that something's not quite right there. So yes, if you provide them with, oh, here's a tool, but then there's no looking it over, and they study it, and then you find out after the exam, oh, well, you mismapped this. So I'll have my students send me my freshmen, I'll have them send me their concept maps, and I'll look them over. And what happened when I had them do that, I had one group of students, I was thrilled that they concept maps their major macromolecules. And I alerted them, I said, these are great concept maps in the sense that you're getting the general picture, but please remember the exam is going to be very, very detailed, and there will be more detail that could be used on these maps. You could take each one of these major proteins, you can take proteins, you can take sugars, carbohydrates, and you can make a map of just each one of those, not overall. So the overall was great, but the exam was not just about the overall general. The exam was very, very specific about protein structure. And so what the students had done was they had taken my praise and said, oh good, she says that's great. They were studying that. They neglected their notes and the details of their notes. And unfortunately, that worked not in their favor. So we want to remind our students sometimes that, you know, maps can be at different levels. And you need to remind yourself of what is the assessment you're going to have on this material and at what level you're expected to know the material. So you want those to be congruent. Is there any other ideas in terms of problems, disadvantages?
I have a question, and I don't know if it would be a disadvantage, but when you start to do concept maps in the class, do you have to teach the students how to do that?
You all saw how fast you picked it up, right?
So it really doesn't take that long then?
It depends on what you want to be using it for. If I'm going to be using it for my freshman recitation, all I have to do is get across the basic idea. If I'm going to be using it, and the course is going to be concept mapping, I lose a week of material for making sure that the students understand how they're going to make a map, how I'm going to assess them, how that assessment is going to get harder and harder over time because their maps should improve. And then we have a feedback on, is this a good rubric? Do you think this rubric is fair? Halfway through, we need to reassess. I'm going to make things a little harder so that you can't, you know, now you've improved your skills. So it depends on what you're using it for. Yes?
Well, some of it is you can easily see what's right and wrong. But with some of the items, I'm just really curious about how do you grade something that's a matter of interpretation, or maybe they're taking the understanding to a level that you've never been. What do you do with that?
Well, is the class one where you're trying to get them to think deeply about a concept? My ecology and animal behavior courses, when I finish and I have my students present their concept maps to each other, and they have to critically think about it without being harsh and mean to the group who's presenting, I sit back and I love that day. Because I look at those maps and I think, they are presenting material in a much more interesting manner and in a lot more detail than I would necessarily be getting across if I was giving an exam. It's great. So it depends on what you're asking. I mean, the idea is that when I look at some of these, I don't have an expert map and they have to match my map. I'm asking them to think deeply. That's what LD Fink would call significant learning. And so as I concept map my syllabi too. And so let me go to LD Fink's. LD Fink would say significant learning involves as many of these elements as possible, and this you do have. I hope I put that one on. And so significant learning, it gets more significant with the more numbers of these bubbles that you allow. And so if you're asking students to think really, really deeply, then they're doing an awful lot of integrating of information, and that's very complex information, and they're integrating it. And so that's why you can't really have an expert map, because when I mapped some of the primary article that we read on Weddell seals and how Weddell seals in the Arctic sit out and bathe themselves, and actually they have a problem when they're down in the Antarctic, when they're in the Antarctic, they actually have a problem of not being too cold, they have a problem of overheating. And how do they dissipate that extra heat? Some of my students' maps were fantastically complex. Maybe they had gotten to a more complex level than I would have expected. So I don't usually work with expert versus novice. I just say, are you reading this? Are you gaining what you need to gain from this? Great. So you have to have a very, very open mind to creativity too. And so LD Fink would say, they're learning how to learn. They're providing, obviously, everything we offer, we hope has some sort of foundational knowledge. When they're working, some of the best ways that students learn is if they feel that they're applying something, that this can be applied to some real life scenario, and human dimension, and caring. And all of these things can tie in together. Yes?
This is a disadvantage that I imagine might arise for my specific teaching situation. A major task I have is to get my students to write about the subject I teach about and improve their writing skills. my estimation is that it takes almost as much thought and concentration to produce a coherent concept map as it does to produce a coherent essay. A concept map is essentially an outline. It's an outline in other form. By the time, I find, when I was in school, we were told to have little notes and then put them into an outline and then write our essay. And of course very few people do that. What you end up doing is you write your essay, and then after you've written your essay, you create the outline. And of course, if you're a better student, then you rewrite your essay based on your outline. I could see this competing and perhaps even worsening my students' writing if they put too much effort into producing the concept map. They'll have less energy and less time to actually write.
Well, I would say from my own personal experience in terms of using this as a tool to write papers, that the writing of the paper, when you've constructed a good concept map, the writing of the paper actually flows very, it's the final way of how you wanted to say it that takes some time, but it flows pretty nicely, just as when you wrote that outline, how much more articulate you were in your writing. So it might be interesting to try that with students, to say, do one exercise where you are doing a concept map and writing, do another exercise where you're not worrying about concept mapping and you're just writing. Okay?
It seems to me too that some students might actually feel less threatened by concept mapping than they do by the writing assignment, because they've been told for a long time, you're not doing this right, you're not doing this right, you're not, this might be kind of a stepping around it, coming at it from a new angle.
It's very creative. That's a great idea. What I'd like to, we have just a few more minutes, and what I'd like to end with is I do assess my courses. I have multiple assessments, but this is one assessment, and this was only of the first iteration of the course in 2007. I have not included this in my outline. Information is provided in my paper. But I asked students to use, this is from Novak. He says, educating must consider 5 basic elements: the teacher, the learner, knowledge, evaluation, the context of learning. All interact to provide the meaning of experience which can be disempowering or empowering. I asked my 13 students to complete this and to just bold in what elements they felt were appropriate. And I asked them to do this for my CMAPS course. And they statistically overemphasized learner, knowledge, interact, and empowering. So from my course, they felt that the learner was the element that was emphasized, not the teacher. They still felt they gained knowledge. They felt that the learner and knowledge interacted to empower them. And these were statistically significant overemphases of these elements. When I asked them to think about this course, it's hard. I didn't traditionally lecture in this course, but I asked them to think about the traditional lecture course that they had experienced. Then the elements that were overemphasized were teacher, knowledge, and for upper level courses, they felt disempowering. I would argue that if you ask first-year students, they're not going to say that it's disempowering to be lectured to. But these are my juniors and seniors, and they are wanting more than to have me stand up there and lecture. They're wanting their brains to work hard. And so this was their perception. So I do provide literature. I always provide literature so that if there is some of the literature that interests you, you can seek it out. And at this point, I think actually that that's a good stopping point in the interest of your time. I will be meeting with a smaller group afterwards, and we can talk about other assessments that I have done. I would suggest that if you're thinking of working on doing something in Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, as you're thinking about doing it, think about how are you going to assess this. By the time you've assessed your project, and I suggest that you have a knowledge assessment and an attitudinal assessment, and you work with Deborah to devise, proper surveys, and how are you going to measure these things. Once you've done that, you're so close to going to a meeting and presenting this, because you can present these things. Once you've gone to meetings and once you've done these assessments, you can actually start thinking about writing these papers up. I am not a professional educator. That's not my background. I'm an ecologist and animal behaviorist, but I'm now writing in Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And so It's 5 years ago, I would not have known that I would be writing in publishing in Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. But if we take that same approach of, we are going to look at this in a manner, we're going to assess this in a manner. If I'm doing an innovation, why should I stop at the innovation? Why don't I think about assessing it for myself to improve the next time? But also, by the time I've done that, if it's a strong enough assessment tool and I've seen some interesting results, well, I can write up a paper, I can read background literature, let's do it. Okay? So in the interest of assessment, I do appreciate people's suggestions and some things, so if you would fill this out, I would appreciate that very much. And thank you. Thanks very much for taking your time.